What would you think if I told you that the most unforgettable woman is not the one who pleads, not the one who explains, not even the one who loves the loudest, but the one who learns to disappear into silence at the exact moment he expects her to beg? There is something ancient in that kind of quiet, something primal. It is not the absence of words, it is the presence of power. The woman who masters silence is not passive, she is sovereign. And he will feel that silence echo for the rest of his life, not because she left him in rage, but because she left him in stillness. When a woman who once poured herself into a man suddenly chooses silence, it is not a tactic, it is transformation. She has walked the long road of self-sacrifice. She has swallowed words to keep peace. She has bent, twisted, and shrunk herself just to be understood. But one day, something inside her broke, not with anger, but with awakening. She began to realize that silence is not empty. It is full of answers. Carl Jung taught that the unconscious does not speak in words, but in symbols, dreams, absences. The woman who learns this no longer speaks just to be heard. She speaks only when it aligns with truth. And when it doesn't, she becomes the mirror of the man's own emptiness. Her silence does not seek to punish, it reveals. To the unawakened man, this silence feels unbearable. It feels like rejection. But it is not rejection, it is reflection. Her withdrawal of words is the unveiling of everything he projected onto her. He sees not who she is, but who he imagined her to be. And when the echo of her silence meets the hollow places within him, he is left with only himself. The woman who learns to master silence does not do so out of spite. She does it out of evolution. She has grown weary of being misunderstood. She has come to realize that not every emotion must be explained, not every slight must be addressed. She no longer throws herself at the altar of over-explanation. She lets the energy speak for itself, and energy always speaks louder than words. This kind of woman is not icy. She is elemental. She understands that silence is not the absence of love, it is the language of self-respect. She no longer stays in places where she has to convince someone of her worth. She no longer tries to translate her soul to a man still speaking the dialect of his ego. Do you know what happens when a man experiences this kind of silence from a woman who once gave him everything? He begins to spiral. Not outwardly. No, outwardly he may appear fine, even indifferent. But internally his psyche begins to tremble, because now her silence confronts him in ways her words never could. This is where the anima, the feminine within his unconscious, becomes restless. Jung believed that the anima guides a man toward his emotional maturation. But when he fails to integrate her, when he projects her onto the women around him and refuses to see her within, he becomes addicted to external affirmation. Her silence forces him inward to face what he has avoided. And he will never forget her, not because of what she said, but because of what she stopped saying. Not because she stayed, but because she left without drama. Not because she needed him, but because she finally stopped needing him to become who she already was. You may be this woman now or becoming her. You may feel the deep inner urge to stop explaining yourself, to stop justifying your emotions, to stop trying to speak love into ears that only listen to their own reflection. This is not detachment. This is individuation. This is the return to your core, where your silence becomes your sanctuary, where your energy becomes your boundary, where your stillness becomes your strength. And the more you choose silence over begging, calm over chaos, intuition over impulse, the more your presence becomes unforgettable. Because you are no longer available for confusion. You are no longer accessible to those who only wanted fragments of you. He will never say it aloud, but he will feel it. He will feel it when he meets another woman who speaks too much and says too little. He will feel it when he hears your favorite song and remembers the quiet between your words. He will feel it in the spaces between his distractions. Because silence like that doesn't fade. It lingers. And the woman who mastered it, she becomes myth. She does not rage. She does not chase. She does not perform grief for an audience that cannot hold its weight. She simply withdraws, with elegance, with precision, with the kind of grace that wounds far deeper than fury ever could. Because it is not what she says that haunts him. It is what she no longer needs to say. When a woman chooses silence, it is not an absence. It is a presence too profound for chaos to touch. This kind of silence is not born from fear. It is born from clarity. The woman who once filled every silence with anxious explanation now sits in her stillness like a throne. She no longer reaches to mend what another refuses to fix. She no longer softens herself into palatable pieces just to keep love alive. She lets what falls, fall. And this is what terrifies the man who once believed she would never leave. Because the woman who masters silence has also mastered detachment, not from feeling, but from illusion. She no longer confuses chemistry with compatibility. She no longer confuses longing with truth. She knows that obsession is often unhealed trauma, dressed as destiny. She has seen how the ego clings to patterns under the guise of passion. And so she no longer fights for someone's potential. She no longer writes poems in the cracks of someone's avoidance. She stops confusing her empathy with purpose. Her silence is not cruel. It is clean. It is the final act of self-respect in a world that taught her to sacrifice herself to be loved. To the man who has not done the inner work, her silence is maddening. He cannot place it. He cannot manipulate it. He cannot seduce it back into submission, because she is no longer playing the game. She has removed herself from the board entirely. In Jungian terms, she has withdrawn her projection. She has stopped seeing her own inner masculine, her protector, her sacred witness, in the man who could not hold her. And in doing so, she forces him to confront the emptiness within himself. Her silence becomes a mirror, and mirrors do not lie. A man cannot forget a woman who refuses to explain her worth, who walks away not because she stopped loving him, but because she started loving herself more. He cannot forget the woman who no longer sought resolution from him because she found it within. The one who stopped asking him to show up and simply showed up for herself instead, because something breaks in him, quietly, not all at once, but in waves, in moments, in the pause after he sends a message and receives no reply, in the echo of her laughter replaying in his mind during a lonely night, in the realization that her absence feels more alive than the presence of anyone who came after her. And by then, it's too late, because silence is not a strategy. It is an arrival. It is the threshold a woman crosses when she has finally remembered who she is. You, perhaps, are nearing that threshold. Maybe you're tired, not in the way that sleep can fix, but in the way that truth demands. Tired of talking to brick walls, tired of shrinking your voice just to be heard, tired of trying to prove your value in rooms that lack the capacity to recognize it. And so your silence begins, not as punishment, but as preservation. You start walking differently, speaking less, feeling more. Your energy becomes measured, intentional, refined. You no longer give freely what costs you peace. You no longer seek closure from mouths that only open to defend, not to understand. You no longer look for signs in men who speak in riddles. And in this new realm of silence, you become a force. Not because you are hard, but because you are whole. Not because you have stopped loving, but because you now love wisely. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." And when your soul is no longer stained by chaos, by desperation, by the ache of being misunderstood, it becomes luminous, clean, holy, and very few can meet you there. But those who can will never take your silence as an absence. They will hear it for what it is, an invitation into truth. And those who can't, they'll never forget you. She is not unforgettable because she left with fire. She is unforgettable because she left with grace. There is a rare, unspeakable power in a woman who walks away quietly, not out of indifference, but out of self-respect so loud it silences every room she ever stepped into. And to the man who once believed she would always stay, her departure marks the beginning of his confrontation with reality. You see, Jung understood that the psyche is structured by archetypes, unconscious blueprints of human experience. The woman who embodies silence becomes the archetype of the wise feminine, the one who no longer dances for crumbs of affection. She becomes a mirror of his unlived life, the part of him that resisted evolution. To the unintegrated masculine, she was never meant to be understood. She was meant to be consumed, used to soothe a wound, held until he no longer needed her. But when she withdrew with silence, she broke the pattern, and in breaking it, she became the soul he will never quite recover from. He may move on in form, find another lover, chase novelty, post happiness. But in the quiet, in the moments between distraction and sleep, her presence will return, not because she's holding on, but because she let go entirely. And the psyche, when met with something that complete, doesn't forget. She was not noise. She was knowing. She didn't beg for him to understand. She simply understood. She saw through the performative affection, the inconsistency, the smallness of a love that had to be chased, and she refused to explain why it was no longer enough. She just stopped. That is what echoes. Not the goodbye, but the void where her energy once lived. Her patience, her softness, her willingness to hold space for a man who did not yet know how to hold himself. He'll realize it not when he's surrounded by noise, but when the silence finally catches him. Alone. Still. Unloved by the world in the way she loved him. And for you, the woman becoming her, this path is not without ache. There are nights where your silence will roar inside your chest. There are moments when your absence from his life will feel like a death you chose to die without ceremony. But do not confuse grief with regret. You did not lose him. You released him. You stopped being the balm for wounds that weren't yours. You stopped auditioning for love in a story you were born to rewrite. You became the woman who no longer chases. She chooses. And it's that choice, that stillness, that boundary made from inner gold, that is unforgettable. Do you understand the rarity of a woman who can sit with herself without needing to be seen, heard, validated, or explained? Who can feel the ache of goodbye and not call it a failure? Who can let a man drift into the void and not reach to pull him back, but allow him to meet himself there? This is not weakness. This is the strength of a woman who has done the shadow work, who has danced with her wounds, who has made peace with the parts of herself that once begged to be chosen. She has remembered her wholeness, and in doing so, she becomes the one who no longer seeks completion in another. He'll remember her every time he encounters a woman who reacts, who chases, who fills the space with anxious noise. And he'll feel a hollow echo where her silence used to be, a place so full of presence it needed no words. Jung would say that this is the turning of the wheel, the moment when the projection shatters and the soul is forced inward. He projected his anima onto her, made her his emotional compass, his ideal, his container. And when she left, he was left with a mirror of what he had not yet integrated. And some will rise from that mirror. They will meet themselves, finally. They will become men who can love in truth, but others will simply remember, not with words, but with longing, not with blame, but with ache. Because you, in your silence, became something eternal. You became a chapter they cannot rewrite, a version of love they cannot recreate. And even if he never tells a soul, even if he pretends you were just a phase, know this, the woman who mastered silence became the woman he'll never forget. There's a reason why silence carries a spiritual weight. In many ancient traditions, silence was considered sacred, an access point to divine knowing. Not just the absence of sound, but the presence of the soul. A portal where the surface self dissolves, and what remains is truth in its most unshakable form. This is the terrain the unforgettable woman walks. She does not scream to be understood. She does not wage war for closure. She no longer confuses attention with affection. Instead, she disappears, not out of bitterness, but out of reverence for herself. And when she leaves completely. Not just in body, but in energy, in emotion, in unconscious tether. That is what haunts him. He may not grasp it intellectually. His ego may dismiss her departure as emotional, irrational, or too sensitive. But the soul doesn't lie. The soul remembers where it met depth. And no matter how much he tries to move on, no matter how many distractions or new faces pass through his world, there will always be a presence missing from the room, hers. Because she didn't just give him love, she gave him reflection. She mirrored his emotional blind spots. She stood in the space where his wounds played out and offered him a chance to evolve. And when he failed to rise to that invitation, she didn't retaliate. She removed herself. The silence she offered was not a punishment. It was a message, a sacred withdrawal, a spiritual boundary drawn by someone who no longer negotiates with their own self-worth. And this silence speaks louder than anger ever could. It says, I have seen enough. It says, I do not chase what confuses me. It says, I will not lose myself to teach you how to love me. This is what makes her unforgettable. Not her beauty, not her laughter, not even the memories, but the way she honored herself in the moment he expected her to crumble. Do you know how rare that is? In a world that encourages women to prove, to beg, to explain, to make their wounds palatable, their needs smaller, their truths more convenient. She chose another path, the path of sacred detachment. She is not cold. She is not numb. In fact, she feels more than most. But her silence is her rite of passage, her return to sovereignty. She has stopped making homes in people who live like storms. She has stopped seeking light in those who feed off her fire. And she has stopped apologizing for being a woman who knows her heart, knows her pain, knows when to hold on and when to walk away. Seneca wrote, "Sometimes even to live is an act of courage." But for her, to leave in silence, to walk away with no dramatic declarations, no demand for closure, that is the act of courage few speak of, because it means choosing peace over proof. It means letting go of control. It means trusting that what is not aligned with her truth is not meant to remain. He will never say it, but he will measure every woman after her against that silence, against that moment she left without turning back. He will remember the quiet strength in her eyes, the way her energy vanished like mist, the way she didn't collapse under the weight of his indecision, because she no longer needed his validation to feel whole. And this is where the true wound opens in him, not from rejection, but from recognition. Recognition of how he mishandled something sacred. Recognition of the fact that he was not ready for the depth she offered. Recognition of the boy within him who still needed noise to feel real, who mistook chaos for connection. And now he's left in the wake of her silence, a silence that doesn't beg to be remembered, but is impossible to forget. If you are this woman, or if you are becoming her, know this. Your silence is not emptiness. It is power. It is the final word in a language no longer spoken. It is the closing of a door not with a slam, but with reverence. And in that final act, you teach him something no conversation ever could. That love is not proven through suffering. That worth is not negotiated through pain. That absence, when chosen with dignity, becomes the most unforgettable presence of all. And so she disappears, not like smoke, but like a sacred myth returning to the forest of herself. She does not post a goodbye. She does not explain the silence. She lets the silence become her answer, her rebellion, her resurrection. And in doing so, she transforms the very fabric of what he once thought a woman should be. This isn't just emotional strategy. This is alchemy. Her stillness becomes the crucible in which his ego begins to burn. The man who once fed on validation now finds himself starved, not of attention, but of meaning, because the one who gave him depth without demand is gone, and she is not coming back to prove what he failed to feel when it was freely given. Carl Jung called this withdrawal of projection. When the anima, his inner feminine, is no longer unconsciously placed upon the woman outside him, he must reckon with himself. He must now source internally what he used to extract externally. But for most men, this moment comes too late. He does not rise until she is gone. Her silence forces this confrontation. It is not petty. It is not cruel. It is initiation. She no longer holds space for a man who cannot hold himself. She has stopped pouring herself into empty containers. And that absence, that elegant refusal to overfunction, is what lingers in his subconscious. Like a ghost with perfume still on the air, like a dream half remembered at dawn. He'll hear her in the spaces between arguments with someone new. He'll feel her in the quiet after intimacy, when the energy doesn't quite reach his soul. He'll recall how she didn't demand, but deserved. How she didn't manipulate, but mirrored. How her silence wasn't cold, it was whole. You, the woman becoming her, must know, it is not weakness to be silent. It is sovereignty. It is the choice to stop over-explaining your value to someone whose wounds cannot yet recognize you. It is the turning inward toward your own integration. The part where you stop playing savior and start becoming self. Silence becomes your sacred threshold. The place where you stop losing pieces of yourself for the sake of connection. Where you recognize that no amount of explaining will teach someone to value what they are not yet evolved enough to see. This kind of woman becomes unforgettable because she never begged to be remembered. She's simply left with nothing but the sound of her own truth behind her. And if you're still waiting to be heard, still hoping he'll finally understand, ask yourself, what are you waiting for him to reflect that you have not yet claimed within yourself? The moment you stop outsourcing your self-worth, everything changes. Because men do not forget the woman who taught them silence isn't rejection, it's revelation. the revelation of her boundaries, the revelation of her capacity, the revelation of everything he refused to meet in himself. And by the time he finally understands, she's already rebuilt her temple. She now walks through the world with a different gait, soft but unyielding, magnetic but not chasing, present but no longer grasping. She speaks when it matters. She smiles when it's true. She engages when her soul says yes, not when her fear says don't lose him. This is the woman he cannot replace, because her value was never in how loudly she loved him, but in how quietly she left when she realized he couldn't hear her heart beating in the silence. This woman, in her silence, becomes a rite of passage for the men she meets. She becomes the threshold between boyhood and manhood, between projection and presence, between unconscious hunger and conscious love. And though he may not know it now, one day, perhaps years later, he'll sit in a quiet room long after the world has moved on, and the only thing left will be her echo. Not her voice, not her messages, not her tears, just the silence, the sacred, impossible silence of the woman who mastered it. He will never tell his friends. He will never confess it aloud. But in the quiet hours, after the party, after the noise, after the laughter dies, her silence will revisit him. It will not shout. It will whisper. It will wrap itself around the edges of his memory like smoke, like a sacred script written on the inside of his soul. Because this kind of woman does not just walk through his life. She passes through his psyche like a dream too profound to explain, too archetypal to forget. And Jung knew what passes through the unconscious with great emotional weight never truly leaves. It roots, it marks, it changes the structure from within. The woman who once spoke with her eyes, who gave generously from her heart, who held the emotional line even when he dropped it, when she goes silent, something inside him fractures. Not from her cruelty, but from her clarity. She becomes the very thing his ego fears the most. A mirror too honest to look into. You see, the silent woman is not mysterious by effort. She is mysterious because she is sovereign. She is no longer accessible to the projections of a man who has not met his own shadow. She no longer accommodates confusion. She no longer dances for the emotionally unavailable. She does not perform for love. And so she terrifies him, not because she's dangerous, but because she's done. He'll try to replicate her with another. He'll search for her in faces that feel familiar, in the way someone moves, in the scent of a certain perfume, in the way a song feels when the light hits just right. But it won't be her, because what he's chasing isn't the woman. It's the way he felt in her presence before she went silent. He remembers the safety, the reflection, the subtle spiritual tug in her presence that called something out of him he didn't know he needed to find. But he wasn't ready. His wounds weren't ready. His ego wasn't ready. And so he did what the unawakened do. He took her depth for granted and called her too much. And now her silence speaks for her. And you, the woman awakening into this silence, must understand this. Your withdrawal is not abandonment. It is not cruelty. It is not heartlessness. It is the final act of truth. The truth that you were not made to bleed for love, that your softness is not weakness, that your presence is sacred, and that anyone who confuses your peace for emptiness is not meant to hold your soul. This is your individuation, your psychic emergence, the moment where you no longer orbit around someone else's inability to love you deeply. You return to your center. You rebuild your temple. You refine your energy so sharply that even your silence becomes magnetic. The Stoics taught that external chaos is never to be feared, but internal chaos, that is the true enemy. And this woman, the silent woman, is no longer at war with herself. She has calmed the storm within, and that's why she can walk away, not because she has less to say, but because she has nothing left to prove. In her silence is not suppression, but transcendence. The absence of her voice is not a void. It is the sound of boundaries crystallizing, of self-love maturing, of illusions burning away. And that is unforgettable, because true silence, the kind born from inner work, from shadow integration, from a full dismantling of egoic attachment, that is a language only the awakened understand. And the man who once thought she'd never leave now finds himself haunted by a language he never bothered to learn. Now she speaks only in energy, in detachment, in peace. And to the man who depended on her pain to feel powerful, her peace is the most unbearable loss, because now he must find meaning on his own. Now he must sit with the parts of himself that used to be numbed by her attention. He is left with what she left behind, his own silence. And in that silence, a question echoes louder than any goodbye. Why did I not rise when she was still willing to love me? But the answer doesn't come, because the woman who mastered silence does not return to explain. She does not come back to soften the blow. She does not reach back to hold a hand that let her go. She walks forward, quietly, fully, eternally. And in that silence, she becomes legend.